The conference room at NASA was sterile, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare on the long table. Captain Marcus Heller sat at the head, his calloused hands gripping a manila folder stamped classified. Around him, the team exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't just another mission, it was a descent into the unknown. "Thank you for volunteering," Heller began, his gravelly voice breaking the silence. "The Bermuda Triangle has claimed countless lives. Flights vanish without a trace, ships disappear, and no one knows why. Our job is to find answers." Dr. Adrian Holt leaned forward, his fingers steepled under his chin. "Answers," he repeated, his tone skeptical. "For decades, science has tried and failed to explain the anomalies. Magnetic field disruptions, methane hydrates, even supernatural nonsense. What makes us think we'll succeed?" Heller's gaze hardened. "Because we're taking this straight to the source. NASA's data indicates a gravitational disturbance that's intensified over the last 5 years. We'll be flying directly into it." Victor Kane's hand shot up nervously. "Flying into it?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Isn't that, how people disappear?" "That's why we're here," Shaw interjected, his notebook open, pen poised. "To document, analyze, and understand what's happening. The public deserves to know." "Deserves to know?" Digger Cole scoffed, leaning back in his chair. His rugged face was etched with skepticism. "You think the public cares about anything but headlines? NASA crew lost in Triangle. That's what they'll write when this goes south." Heller slammed his hand on the table, silencing the room. "This isn't a debate. You all agreed to this mission. We leave tomorrow." As the team filed out, Holt lingered, his pale eyes fixed on Heller. "You're not just here to find answers," he said quietly. "You're here because of your son." Heller didn't reply. He simply walked out, his boots echoing in the empty corridor. The flight began like any other. The specially modified Phoenix 7 glided through the clear skies, its sleek body reflecting the early morning sun. Inside, the team sat in tense silence, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of their monitors. "Altitude steady at 30,000 feet, Kane reported from the co-pilot's seat, his voice clipped. His hands trembled as he adjusted the controls. "No anomalies yet." Heller scanned the horizon, his jaw tight. "Keep your eyes on the instruments, things can change fast out here." In the cabin, Holt monitored gravitational data on his tablet. The readings were steady, but something felt off. The air seemed heavier, the horizon unnaturally sharp. He glanced at Digger, who was sharpening a knife out of habit. "Feeling lucky, Cole?" Holt asked. "Luck's got nothing to do with it," Digger replied, not looking up. "I trust my gear, not the guy who talks about gravitational vortexes." Shaw sat nearby, his camera trained on the cockpit. "What do you expect to find?" he asked Holt. "Some kind of wormhole? Alien interference?" Holt didn't smile. "Interdimensional rifts. If my theories are correct, the Bermuda Triangle is a natural gateway, a tear between dimensions. Flights don't just disappear, they're reassigned." Shaw raised an eyebrow. "Reassigned? To somewhere else," Holt said flatly. Before Shaw could press further, the plane jolted violently. Kane cursed, gripping the controls. "What the hell was that?" "Stay calm," Heller ordered. "Turbulence?" "No," Kane said, his voice shaking. "The instruments are—" The cockpit lights flickered, and the plane jolted again, this time harder. Alarms blared, and the horizon outside tilted sharply. "We're losing altitude," Kane shouted. "Something's pulling us down." The Phoenix 7 lurched violently, its sleek frame groaning under the strain of forces no aircraft was built to endure. The cabin filled with a cacophony of alarms, flashing lights, and panicked voices as the horizon tilted dangerously to the left. Captain Marcus Heller gripped the armrests of his seat, his sharp eyes darting between the controls and the windows. The ocean below was no longer a placid blue expanse, but a swirling maelstrom of black and green, its surface dotted with strange patterns that pulsed in rhythm with the shuddering plane. "Altitude dropping fast," Victor Kane shouted from the co-pilot's seat. His hands trembled as he fought the yoke, sweat beading on his forehead. "Throttle's unresponsive." Manual override, Hella barked, leaning forward. Cut autopilot and stabilize the wings. I'm trying. Kane's voice cracked with desperation. The instruments flickered wildly, their readings veering into incomprehensible territory. Speed indicators spiraled out of control, altitude gauges fluctuated erratically, and a low, keening hum resonated through the cabin like a living thing. In the back, Dr. Adrian Holt clung to his workstation, his tablet strapped to the console. His usually calm demeanor was gone, replaced by wide-eyed panic. Gravitational flux off the charts, he shouted, his voice barely audible over the alarms. It's like the plane's caught in a sinkhole. Digger Cole, strapped into his seat, braced against the violent turbulence. His knuckles were white as he gripped the armrests, his face a mask of grim determination. What the hell kind of sinkhole pulls a plane out of the sky? Ryan Shaw, still clutching his camera, recorded the chaos with trembling hands. Is this it? He muttered, half to himself. Is this what happened to them? To all of them? The plane jolted again, harder this time. Overhead, compartments burst open, spilling their contents across the cabin. Hella's voice rang out over the comms, commanding and steady despite the chaos. Brace for impact. Everyone, secure yourselves now. Kane glanced at Hella, his eyes filled with dread. We're not going to make it, are we? Do your job, Kane, Hella snapped. Keep this bird steady. Holt's tablet emitted a shrill warning, and he looked down to see the data stream flashing red. Something's beneath us, he yelled, his voice rising. A massive energy signature. It's pulling us down. What do you mean, something? Digger growled, his voice tight with anger. What kind of something? Before Holt could answer, the plane bucked violently, the nose dipping as the Phoenix 7 plummeted toward the swirling ocean below. Through the windows, the water's surface seemed impossibly close, its strange patterns glowing brighter, their pulses synchronizing with the plane's descent. Pull up, Hella barked, his hands gripping the yoke alongside Kane's. All power to the engines! Get us out of this dive! The engines roared in protest, their whine climbing to a piercing scream. The plane trembled, its frame straining as the crew fought to regain control. For a brief, fleeting moment, the descent slowed, and it seemed as though they might pull out of the dive. But then, the hum beneath them grew louder, resonating through the entire aircraft. The glowing patterns on the ocean's surface expanded, converging into a single, blindingly bright circle directly beneath the Phoenix 7. The pull intensified, and the plane was yanked downward with an unstoppable force. The last thing the crew saw before impact was the glowing circle erupting into a vortex, its spiraling tendrils reaching up to envelop the plane. The cockpit windows shattered under the pressure, water flooding in as the Phoenix 7 was consumed. And then, there was silence. The silence was suffocating, a heavy blanket draped over the absence of chaos. Captain Marcus Heller opened his eyes slowly, his vision swimming with blurred shapes and dim light. His chest heaved as he coughed violently, expelling salty liquid from his lungs. The sharp tang of seawater burned his throat, but his first thought was simple. I'm alive. Around him, the remains of the Phoenix 7 lay scattered, pieces of its sleek body embedded in the strange, soft ground beneath him. The cockpit was gone, the instruments shattered, but the air he was breathing. It wasn't the pressurized cabin or the surface air he knew, but it was breathable. The realization made his skin crawl. Kane? Heller rasped, his voice echoing faintly in the strange stillness. Holt? Digger? Shaw? A groan came from nearby. Digger Cole sat up slowly, wincing as he clutched his side. His rugged face was streaked with dirt and blood, but his sharp eyes were alert. I'm here, he said, his voice rough. Thought I was dead. You might wish you were, came the muttered voice of Dr. Adrian Holt. The astrophysicist was sprawled a few feet away, his glasses cracked but still perched on his nose. He was staring at his surroundings with wide, disbelieving eyes. Where are we? Heller pushed himself to his feet, his boots sinking into the soft, spongy ground. The landscape stretched out before them, impossibly vast and alien. The sky above was not a sky at all, but a shimmering expanse of translucent water, its surface undulating faintly. Beyond the wreckage of the plane, bioluminescent flora dotted the horizon, their eerie glow casting long shadows across the ground. "We're underwater," Heller said slowly, his voice tinged with disbelief. "But we can breathe." "That's not possible," Victor Kane stammered, crawling out from behind a broken section of the fuselage. His face was pale, his hands shaking. "We should be dead. The pressure alone." "We're not on Earth anymore," Holt interrupted, his voice flat. He stood unsteadily, brushing debris from his suit. "The gravitational anomaly, the energy signature, this isn't just underwater. We've passed through something." "Passed through what?" Digger snapped. "We crash-landed into the damn ocean." "No," Holt said, shaking his head. "Look around you. Does this look like any ocean you've ever seen?" The others followed his gaze. The landscape was surreal. Giant, glowing structures that resembled coral, but were far too symmetrical, rose in the distance, their surfaces etched with intricate angular patterns. The ground beneath them was soft and faintly translucent, pulsing faintly with light. Streams of bubbles drifted lazily upward, disappearing into the undulating water above. Shaw stumbled into view, his camera still clutched tightly in his hands. His face was ashen, his breath shallow. "I recorded it," he said, his voice trembling. "The vortex, the light, it pulled us in." Heller moved toward him, gripping his shoulder firmly. "Get it together, Shaw," he said. "We need to figure out where the hell we are. And how we're still alive," Digger added darkly. He ran a hand over his stubbled jaw, his eyes scanning the alien landscape. "This place doesn't feel right." "It's not just the place," Holt murmured, staring at the horizon. His voice was distant, almost reverent. "It's what's here." "What do you mean?" Kane asked nervously. Holt pointed, his trembling finger aimed toward a massive structure in the distance. It was difficult to see at first, shrouded in the faint glow of the bioluminescent environment, but as the group followed his gesture, their breaths caught in their throats. A colossal archway rose from the ground, its surface carved with the same angular patterns that adorned the coral-like structures. The arch was impossibly large, dwarfing any human-made structure they had ever seen. Its edges shimmered faintly, and within its frame the water rippled unnaturally as though disturbed by some unseen force. "It's a portal," Holt whispered, his voice filled with awe. "It's alive." The air, or whatever it was they were breathing, seemed to vibrate, and a deep resonant hum began to fill the space. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, something vast and incomprehensible pressing down on them from all sides. "We need to leave," Kane said, his voice rising with panic. "We need to get out of here, now." "Leave?" Shaw said, his voice hollow. "Leave how?" "Look around. We're not in Kansas anymore." Heller stepped forward, his jaw set. "We don't panic," he said firmly. "We figure out what this is and if there's a way back. Holt, you're the expert. Start explaining." But Holt didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the portal, his expression a mixture of wonder and terror. "We're not the first ones here," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Look." The others turned toward the base of the archway. Scattered around it were remnants of wreckage, planes, ships, vehicles, twisted and corroded beyond recognition. And among them faint shapes moved, their forms distorted and alien in the flickering light. The air, or whatever passed for it in this alien undersea world, grew colder as the group approached the massive archway. The towering structure loomed ahead, its faintly glowing carvings casting long, shifting shadows across the surreal landscape. The hum emanating from the portal was stronger now, vibrating through the ground beneath their boots and into their bones. Heller led the way, his military instincts keeping him alert despite the overwhelming strangeness of their surroundings. Behind him, Digger Cole carried a salvaged metal rod from the plane's wreckage, his knuckles white as he gripped it like a weapon. Kane and Shaw followed hesitantly, their eyes darting to the horizon, while Dr. Adrian Holt lagged behind, absorbed in his tablet, which was somehow still operational and displaying a chaotic flood of unreadable data. "Stay close," Heller said, his voice low and commanding. "We don't know what's out here." "What's out here?" Kane repeated nervously. "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" Wreckage everywhere, and none of it makes sense. How did this stuff get here? Shaw knelt beside a twisted chunk of metal partially embedded in the spongy ground. The remnants of faded markings were just visible along its surface. He wiped at the grime and sucked in a sharp breath. "This is a piece of Flight 709, he said, his voice trembling. "The one that vanished 5 years ago." 5 years? Kane asked, his voice rising. "This thing looks like it's been here for centuries. Look at the corrosion." "It's not just planes," Holt interjected, gesturing toward a nearby pile of debris. Among the wreckage were the unmistakable remains of a ship's hull, its nameplate warped beyond recognition. Nearby lay a rusted vehicle, its tires long gone, but its frame eerily intact. "This place isn't just under the triangle," Holt said, his tone reverent. "It is the triangle. Everything that's been lost here, it's all collected in this pocket of space." "Space?" Digger growled. "We're underwater, Doc." "No," Holt corrected, his eyes fixed on the portal. "We're somewhere else entirely." The group fell silent as they neared the base of the archway. The wreckage became denser here, twisted metal and fractured glass piled high like offerings at an altar. And scattered among the debris were things far more disturbing. Bones. Shaw froze as his foot struck something solid. He looked down to find a human skull, its surface worn smooth. "Oh, God," he whispered, stumbling back. "They didn't make it," Kane muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whoever they were, they didn't make it out." Digger crouched beside another pile of remains, his rugged face set in a grim frown. "This is recent," he said, holding up a fragment of a torn flight jacket. The stitching was still visible, though frayed and faded. "Some of this wreckage is old as hell, but some of it... this... isn't." Hella's gaze locked on the portal itself. Up close, it was even more massive than they'd imagined, its edges stretching beyond their field of vision. The space within its frame shimmered and rippled like water disturbed by an unseen force. But it wasn't water, it was something else, something alive. The hum grew louder, becoming a deep, resonant tone that seemed to emanate from the portal itself. As they stared, shapes began to appear within the rippling space. They were faint at first, like shadows seen through fog, but they grew clearer with each passing moment. "What the hell is that?" Kane asked, backing away. His voice was shrill, panic rising in his chest. The shadows moved. They were humanoid but wrong, distorted, elongated forms with limbs that bent in impossible ways. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as though they were studying the newcomers. The hum shifted, becoming a series of low, rhythmic pulses that felt disturbingly like speech. "They're watching us," Shaw whispered, unable to look away. "They're waiting," Holt corrected, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and dread. He stepped closer to the portal, his tablet clutched tightly in his hands. "This isn't just a gateway, it's a signal." "A signal to what?" Hella demanded, his hand resting on the sidearm holstered at his hip, a weapon he now realized was useless in this place. Holt turned to him, his eyes wide and glassy. "A signal to whoever built it, or whoever controls it." The shadows within the portal moved closer, their forms shifting and blending with the rippling surface. The hum became a deep, guttural roar that shook the ground beneath their feet. The air grew colder, and the bioluminescent lights along the portal's edges flared brightly, casting the wreckage in harsh, flickering light. Digger stepped back, raising his makeshift weapon. "We've seen enough," he growled. "We need to leave. Now." Hella nodded. "Agreed. Fall back." Before he could finish, the ground beneath them shuddered violently, and the portal's light flared to a blinding intensity. The roar became deafening, and the wreckage around them began to shift, as though something massive was moving beneath the surface. "We're out of time," Hella shouted. "Move!" But as the team turned to flee, the portal surged and the rippling shapes emerged into the world beyond. The rippling surface of the portal shimmered violently, the shapes within becoming sharper, more defined. The figures stepped forward, their movements fluid and deliberate. As they emerged fully, the air grew colder, heavier, as though their presence was altering the very fabric of the space around them. The creatures were tall, their elongated bodies shimmering like liquid metal, yet they moved with an organic grace. Their limbs split and reformed as they walked, shifting shapes that made it impossible to tell where one part ended and another began. Eyes, if they could be called that, glimmered faintly across their forms, unblinking and fixed on the crew. "What the hell are those things?" Kane whispered, his voice trembling. "They're not alive," Holt said, his voice filled with a mix of terror and fascination. "At least, not in the way we understand life. They're manifestations, projections of something from beyond." Digger took a step back, his grip tightening on the metal rod in his hands. "Projections or not, they're real enough to kill us. We need to go now." The creatures moved closer, their forms bending and shifting unnaturally. The ground beneath the crew pulsed faintly, a rhythm that matched the low, resonant hum emanating from the portal. The air itself seemed to vibrate, the sound invading their minds, filling their thoughts with images they couldn't comprehend. Vast, alien landscapes, towering structures that defied geometry, and an overwhelming sense of insignificance. "It's speaking to us," Holt murmured, his voice trembling. He stepped closer to the portal, ignoring the protests of the others. "This isn't an attack, it's communication." "Are you insane?" Hella barked, grabbing Holt by the arm and pulling him back. "That thing isn't trying to talk, it's trying to control us." But it was too late. The hum grew louder and the shapes around the portal expanded, their edges blurring as though merging with the environment. The light from the portal flared, illuminating the wreckage and casting grotesque shadows across the landscape. The crew fell to their knees, clutching their heads as the sound reached a deafening crescendo. Hella forced himself to his feet, his vision blurred and his head pounding. He grabbed Holt by the shoulders, shaking him violently. "What are they saying? What do they want?" Holt's eyes were wide, glassy, as though he were staring into something far beyond the portal. "It's not just a gateway," he said, his voice distant. "It's an invitation, a beacon. They've been calling us for centuries." "To what end?" Shaw demanded, his voice rising with panic. "Why bring us here?" Holt turned to him, his face pale. "Because we're the next step. They're preparing us." The word sent a chill through the group. Hella turned toward the portal, his eyes narrowing. "Number. We're leaving. Whatever this is, we're not part of it." The ground beneath them trembled violently, and the portal surged again. This time, the light within shifted, revealing something even more horrifying, a massive shape moving within the rippling surface. It was impossible to discern its true form, but its sheer size dwarfed the portal itself. Tendrils of shadow extended outward, reaching for the edges of the archway, as though whatever was inside was struggling to emerge. "What the hell is that?" Digger shouted, backing away. Holt stared at the portal, his voice barely a whisper. "It's the architects. They're coming." The hum became a roar, the vibrations shaking the very air. The shapes within the portal pressed forward, their forms distorting as they reached the threshold. The wreckage around the archway began to shift and rise as though being drawn into the light. "We're out of time," Hella shouted. "Move, now!" The crew turned and ran, their movements frantic as the portal flared behind them. The ground buckled and cracked, sending debris flying as the landscape itself seemed to collapse inward. The roaring sound followed them, growing louder with every step. "Keep moving," Hella barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Don't look back." But as they ran, the light from the portal surged one final time, illuminating the entire area. The shadowy shapes within expanded outward, their forms stretching impossibly far. And then, with a deafening crack, the ground beneath them gave way, plunging the crew into darkness. The fall felt endless, the crew tumbling through a void of black and crimson light. The air, or whatever they were breathing, grew colder, heavier, pressing against their bodies like a living force. Their cries of terror echoed, swallowed by the infinite darkness around them. Captain Marcus Heller clutched at the emptiness, his instincts screaming for something to grab hold of, something solid, but there was nothing. Then, as suddenly as the fall began, it ended. Heller hit the ground with a jarring thud, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. The surface beneath him was not solid, but soft and pliant, pulsing faintly beneath his weight. He groaned, pushing himself up slowly, his body protesting every movement. Around him, the others lay scattered, their breaths shallow but alive. "Is everyone okay?" Heller rasped, his voice hoarse. Digger Cole was the first to respond, coughing violently as he staggered to his feet. "Define okay," he muttered, his rugged face etched with exhaustion. "Because I don't think this qualifies." Victor Kane sat up slowly, clutching his chest. I'm alive," he said, his voice trembling. "I think." Ryan Shaw rolled onto his side, his camera miraculously still strapped to his chest. He glanced at it briefly before looking around, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Where are we?" he whispered. Dr. Adrian Holt was last to rise. His glasses were gone, his face pale and streaked with blood. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he stared upward, his expression one of awe and terror. Heller followed his gaze and froze. Above them, the portal loomed larger than before, its edges stretching impossibly far. The shimmering surface rippled violently, its light casting eerie patterns across the landscape. But it was what lay beyond the portal that paralyzed them. A vast alien world sprawled in the distance, its sky a chaotic swirl of colors that defied comprehension. Towering spires pierced the horizon, their surfaces glinting with an unnatural sheen, and massive shadowy forms moved between them, their outlines hazy and indistinct. The ground beneath their feet pulsed faintly, emitting a low, rhythmic hum that matched the vibrations in the air. It was alive, the same as everything else here, part of an ecosystem so alien it defied logic. This isn't Earth," Holt said, his voice barely audible. "We're not even in our dimension anymore." Kane shook his head, his breathing quickening. "No, this can't be real. It's a hallucination, right? A dream. We didn't survive that crash." "We survived," Shaw said, his voice hollow. "But this isn't survival." Heller forced himself to focus, his military training taking over. "Stay together," he ordered, his voice firm. "We need to figure out what this place is and how to get back." "There is no getting back," Holt said, his tone devoid of hope. "This portal, it's not just a gateway, it's a trap. Everything that's ever disappeared in the triangle, it all ends up here." Digger pointed toward the horizon where the shadows of the massive structures seemed to ripple and move. "What about those things?" he asked. "Do they live here, or are they watching us?" Holt didn't answer. He was too focused on the portal, his gaze fixed on the shimmering surface. "They've been calling us," he said finally. "This is their design." Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The hum grew louder, resonating through their bodies like a heartbeat. The light from the portal intensified, casting the alien landscape in sharp relief. And then, it began to emerge. The portal rippled violently, its edges distorting as something massive pressed against it from the other side. The light flared blindingly, forcing the crew to shield their eyes as the ground beneath them quaked. The hum became a roar, a sound so deep and resonant it felt as though the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. Heller squinted through the glare, his heart pounding as a shadow began to take form within the portal. It was colossal, dwarfing the spires in the distance, its shape impossible to define. Tentacles of black and crimson light stretched outward, twisting and writhing as they breached the threshold of the portal. "It's coming through," Holt whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and terror. "The architects." The creature's body was a mass of shifting, amorphous shapes, its surface glistening like liquid metal. Eyes, hundreds of them, opened across its form, their unblinking gaze fixed on the crew. Each eye was different, some glowing with faint cold light, others swirling with colors that seemed to defy reality itself. The ground buckled as the creature moved forward, its tendrils extending outward and brushing against the landscape. Wherever they touched, the alien environment shifted, reshaping itself in response to the creature's presence. "What the hell is it doing?" Digger shouted, his voice breaking with panic. "It's claiming this space," Holt said, his tone filled with resignation. "This isn't just a portal to another world. It's a doorway for them to enter ours." Heller clenched his fists, his mind racing. "We have to stop it. There has to be a way to shut this thing down." "There's no shutting it down," Holt snapped, turning to face him. "This is beyond us, beyond anything we could ever comprehend." The creature let out a deafening roar, the sound reverberating across the alien landscape. The spires in the distance began to crumble, their forms collapsing into the ground as the portal's light expanded, consuming everything in its path. Heller grabbed Holt by the shoulders, shaking him. "Then why bring us here? Why let us see this?" Holt's expression was haunted, his voice barely a whisper. "Because we're the message." The light surged forward, and the last thing they saw was the portal's edges collapsing inward, the creature's massive form engulfing everything. And then there was nothing. The Bermuda Triangle was silent once more.